Hello and welcome to my latest video on how to paint Mortarion of the Death Guard. In this video we're going to be painting the wings on the small nurgling cherubs that are attached to him by chains. You may have seen the finished, or what you thought was the finished video image of Mortarion because I was painting him up to get him finished for Crystal Brush. However, at the time I was having to really rush to get various parts of him finished, and I just kind of painted them for the sake of getting them done rather than spending the time on them to do them how I actually wanted them to be. So on the screen at the moment you can see the paints I'm going to be using. They're the same paints that I've used to paint the large wings on Mortarion, so if you've seen that previous videos you'll already have the paints hopefully ready for this video. But you can see that I'd already painted the top two wings. I wanted to give it a practice run before recording them. The reason for that is, although they look like just miniaturized versions of the ones that were already on Mortarion, because they're so small, they're only like about a centimetre or so high. The details are obviously very small, but I'd already painted very small details on Mortarion's wings, and if you shrink them down you just wouldn't be able to render them. So what you have to do is simplify them quite a lot, while still trying to achieve the same kind of feel. Also, before I started, obviously I had to rip the wings off the original model, so I suggest don't do that, and prepare it beforehand, and just take your time and paint the model how you actually want it to be. It's a really bad idea to rush things for competitions. I always find that I get really frustrated and unhappy with my work just because I don't have the time to actually consider what I'm doing, and you just end up painting things for the sake of painting them. So the wings also had to be prepared exactly the same way that Mortarion's wings did. There is a PDF on the site, the Patreon site, that shows how to prepare Mortarion's wings, and it's just a case of clipping off all the veins on the wings that are sculpted on, then cutting them off with a scalpel, sanding it down, and using a bit of glue and whatever just to soften those details, so you get kind of this smooth canvas to work on. Then I gave it obviously a black prime, and then a quick airbrush of Cadian Fleshtone. So you could see before I actually even started painting on these details that I'd painted on the position of the two eyes. They're only roughly positioned actually, because I'll be tweaking it as I go along. It's such a small area to paint the freehand on that you really have to adapt it as you go along. You're not going to get it perfect the first time. If you look in the top left, you can see the wet palette that I'm using. So you saw the paints that I showed to the camera to start with, but there is one paint that's mixed on there. So in the top right, it does look very dark on the monitor. That's because it's wet paint. It's just the way the light's hitting it. There's not a lot I can do about it. The camera is directly over the paint. It's just that there's a light that I'm using to paint with at the same time, and it's really kind of intensifying the colours a bit strongly there. But the top right paint, it's what I'm using on the wing at the moment. So it's a 50-50 mix of Rhinox hide and Bugmans glow, and the reason for that is I just wanted to get a mid-tone between the Rhinox hide and Bugmans glow. So I'll just go through all the paints that are on the wet palette that I'm going to be using for painting the flesh. So in the top left it's the Ushabti bone, below that is Kislev flesh, in the top middle is Cadian Fleshtone. To the right of that, we've already talked about it, is the 50-50 mix of Bugman's glow and Rhinox hide. Below that is just plain Bugman's glow. To the left of that is pure Rhinox hide. Then at the bottom there is Vallejo model colour black, but you can use any black like Abaddon black or whatever. And the black is not used in the flesh colour, but I wanted it there for when I paint the big black eye dot. But the eyes are going to be in the next video, so it's a two-part video. Just to talk about what I'm actually doing with the paintbrush at the moment, I'm pretty much just using the 50-50 mix of Rhinox hide and Bugmans glow. You can see when it's applied to the model. It's not incredibly opaque. It looks at you can see there's a certain translucent element to it, so you can actually see some of the lines that I've already painted on using the Rhinox hide, which is quite nice. So you can build this up in layers. It's not. It's basically because the Rhinox hide isn't a great. It doesn't have great coverage, but it does have a really nice kind of translucent effect. So you get to build those layers. And the reason that I'm using this is because I need the base to be darker to allow me to build the highlights up. Because at the moment the Cadian Fleshtone base is too light to work on, to get the nice rich flesh tones. But it is nice to get the hard marks for the Rhinox hide on top of it. So it's kind of like sometimes artists like to work on like a grey background or whatever, so you can shade down and highlight up, which is kind of the process that I'm using here. But in this case I'm just darkening down larger areas, just to give me a little bit more tonal range for highlighting up, basically. To the right of the screen you can see that I've got a well palette, and that's also got some Rhinox hide in, and that will allow me to do a little bit of glazing as well. The glazing is quite important for painting the fleshy area, and the reason for that is as you're painting these details on, you have to paint them as quite hard marks, and then you kind of need to soften that down, so you're doing lots and lots of layers, so you can put like a hard mark down of one of the lighter flesh colours, then glows over it, and then add another layer of detail with the flesh colour. So you can basically create transitions using the glazes without having to paint layers of transitions themselves. It just makes life a bit easier to do it that way. Obviously there's some details around the top of the wing. These wings are slightly different to Mortarion's. If you look on his in the area here that I'm painting, they have kind of like these black spikes coming out, which is kind of interesting because obviously I've painted the eyes on Mortarion's wings, and that means that these black spikes then look like eyebrows on top of them, so it worked out quite nicely for me. But on the small ones it doesn't have those, so I just have to kind of make them fit in with the pattern. You can see here what I mean by being able to paint on the details on top of the darker base colour. It's a lot easier to paint these highlights on the darker base colour than it would be to shade down on such a small area. You'd also notice that for most of the painting on this I'm using the tip of the brush, because the area is so small. Again, using the side of the brush, you're just going to cover too much area because the amount of detail that you need to get on there. You really are only going to be able to use the tip of the brush for most of the work, even for blending. I'm using a size 00 artist opus brush, and I would recommend actually using a smaller brush for this as well. And the main reason for that is, although you can use a larger brush, you can use a size 2 if you want, as long as the point's good on it. But you might find that the amount of pressure that you add on the brush, if you just do it slightly too much, you're going to make a much bigger mark than you intended. Whereas on this, you just need lots and lots of small marks. And also, the larger brush has a strong chance of blocking the detail. While you're painting things, you're not actually being able to see what you're painting. So that's one of the reasons that I prefer to use smaller brushes in general. Is that, big brushes just get in the way. Although having said that, I really do like to use larger brushes for glazing. One thing you'll find while painting these is that you're going to struggle anywhere that there's kind of dents or holes or whatever in the wings, they'll just get in the way. So you can see where I kind of did the hole with the lines coming out behind the eye. Those are really easy, and they have them on all 4 of the wings, so that can kind of make all the wings consistent with their patterning. It's really useful to use that. The problem is that the ones, especially if you look on the left wing, which is why I'm not doing it for this video, although you will see the finished piece in the second part of the video, is because it obviously destroys the line work. So you can't just paint the line going through those holes. It just looks really weird. So you have to adapt those imperfections in the wing into the pattern that you're painting on. So here you can see I'm using the black to paint in the eye. When I'm painting the eye itself, this is going to cover the iris and the pupil. So don't be confused when I paint this, and then you compare it to the eyes above it and say this is way too big for the pupil. This is covering both area, and then I'm going to be working on top of this as well, so the pupil will be smaller within this area. But this is giving me a black base for painting the colours of the iris on top of it. When painting this, remember it's supposed to be a big circle, but obviously the top and the bottom of the circle, although more the top, generally the bottom of the eye should be almost, of the iris should be pretty much round, but you know, you have a little bit of leeway. It doesn't matter too much because it obviously depends on how open or closed the eyelids are. But the top of the eye should nearly always be covered slightly, although the angles, I mean the curve of the edge of the iris should still be, you should still be able to make a whole circle, perfect circle going all the way around with it, even though some of it will be covered, if that makes sense. So basically you're doing a big circle and the top and the bottom are cut off. But the reason that I'm putting that on now is it's just helping me to balance all of the tones on the piece, because you tend to start putting in highlights and things, and then you could put in a big block of you know, black in this case, but you know, obviously the colours will be added. But before I did that, it was a large light area right in the middle, and it kind of throws off the rest of the detail that you're painting. So it is quite handy to get in all, you know, block in all of the areas to a certain extent, because it just helps you to balance things as you go along. Here you can see I'm just shrinking the eye down a bit. This eye in particular was quite a bit bigger than the one above it. Now they don't have to match perfectly, and if you just, you know, it wouldn't have made a huge difference, you know, to have the eyes on the lower wings slightly bigger. I think the lower wings are actually a tiny bit larger than the ones above them, so it, you know, it does balance out. But I did want the wings to be fairly similar, you know, just for the sake of it matching on the model. But having said that, the two little cherubs are on either side of him, so you know, you're not going to be comparing them, you know, super closely anyway. So as long as each individual wing, or rather each pair of wings, matches nicely and you know, is fairly balanced, you know, don't worry about having both pairs being identical. Try not to headbutt the camera too. So one thing that you need to pay attention to with the details is, and you can see this on the two finished wings above, is that most of the lines kind of flow into each other. This stops you getting kind of really jarring details that stand out quite strongly and don't fit into the piece well. So the kind of the hole with the lines coming out, the fleshy bits kind of flow out and in nice curves and waves that then flow into the shape of the eye, and like all of the lines kind of curve off in nice sort of similar flowing lines while still creating variation. You'll notice that I'm using the Cadian Fleshtone quite a lot for painting in the lines to start with, and then these lines will then be highlighted with the other two brighter colours, the Kislev flesh and the Ushabti bone. This also allows me to get a little bit of variation, because if you go straight to a bright highlight, and I know the lines do look quite bright on the finished wings, and that's because they've been highlighted up and levels of glazing and things on them. So you know the highlight lines do stand out, but if you just do all of the bright lines straight on top of the dark areas, it's just going to look like hard lines. It's not going to look kind of fleshy and molded into the the surface. It's not like a textured surface. It's just like lines on top of a dark surface. And that's why I'm So I said before about how I'm going to be glazing to add depth to the piece rather than adding the layers, but the layers do become necessary for the highlights on the once you've already got that depth in there, because that then once you've got all those marks on there with some subtle depth, then you have to start picking out various parts just to make the sections pop. So they pop out and like add a kind of texture to the surface. So it's quite often that you'll see me paint textures and things on, and I highlight the lower section, and it makes them look three-dimensional. And it's exactly the same thing on this. So you have all these subtle marks and the depth and all that you've put on there. Then you can then use the highlight sections, the highlight paints, and pick out the lower edges. So you should be able to see some of these things that I'm talking about on the two finished wings already there, especially on the imperfections in the wings that I was talking about before, so like the holes and things, but they're also kind of dents that don't go all the way through, and I've just highlighted the lower edges on those. That makes them look more three-dimensional. Now of course those are already three-dimensional, but I've then done the same thing. So if you look around the edges of the wings, there are these brown dots and things, and then the lower edges of those are all painted as well to make those look three-dimensional, and then that helps the imperfections that are already on the wings kind of blend in, so they just look deeper. But yeah, basically what you're going to be doing is lots and lots of small details, and then building up those layers, then glaze them down and more layers. There's not that much in the way of soft blending, if you like. There is a small amount. So if you look at I keep coming back to it, the hole kind of looks like a butthole. The hole behind the eyes at the end of the wing, where all the lines come out of, the transitions, if you look on there, go quite light in the center to the very center of the hole, and then they soften as they go out. So that some of that's done with layering, but quite soft transitions, just using the three highlight colours of the Cadian Fleshtone, the Kislev flesh, and the Ushabti bone. The hardest part to paint on the whole wing is the section underneath the eyes. If you look at the two finished pieces, there are two lines that go under the eyes, and then I've got very small veins coming off, going over those two lines, so it looks like kind of eyelashes coming off. And this is again something that was taken from the large wings that I'd painted on Mortarion. Now obviously these have to be simplified again, because if you go and look at the ones on Mortarion, there's a lot more marks, and they kind of blend into things, and some of the veins even go into the eyes and stuff like that. But as I mentioned earlier on in the video, you really have to simplify a lot of the details, because if I started doing that and having the veins kind of blend into the eyes, you're going to end up with just too much detail, and you're actually going to reduce the clarity of the image, which is something that you have to be really careful with on freehanding something this much smaller, because there's a limit to how fine you can do the marks when you're painting them. Now you can, I mean, if you want to go crazy and you get like super fine paint brushes with like a few hairs, and kind of use inks, because you need something that paint that flows, so you use black ink, things like that. For really fine details you can do that, but chances are you're not going to be able to see it, and you're going to have a hard time painting it anyway. So I like to work in this method, which is a more simplified method, but the details are very clear. Whereas if you were doing it and you just wanted to basically copy every mark that was on the full scale size wing, you have to kind of interpret the marks. So the idea would be basically take a photograph of the wing, shrink it down, then print it out, and then the computer's done all the hard work for you, for interpreting what these marks will look like on a small scale, and then just copy that, because you will find it very hard to understand the marks that you've got to make them work, because you can't just paint it directly one to one. So if you paint like some veins and things blending into the eye on the big wing, you can't do the same marks on the small wing, because the paint flows differently. You know, it's so small that it just won't look right. Just to talk about the paint consistency a little bit, you can see I'm adding a bit of water to the paints now, because they've started to dry out a bit, but I don't want the paint too thin here. You really need to be able to make the strong marks, so you can see the lines that I've been painting on, they're quite visible. If you water it down too much, it'll make a soft mark, so there'll be translucency to it, which is good for certain things, but in this case you don't want that, because you really need to be able to do these marks to make them visible. So I was just talking about the marks that you make. They on this scale, if they're not clear marks, they kind of become invisible, or it just looks messy. When you see me applying the paint actually on these bits, sometimes I'm using lots and lots of small marks on one line. Apologies that actually the wet palette vanished, my memory card ran out of space. But you've seen all the colours anyway, so it's exactly the same process carrying on. But yeah, so the lines, when I'm doing them, I keep going over the same lines. It's because the paint's a little bit thicker. You know, it's not flowing that smoothly, but it's still thin enough that I can do a neat line. If the paint's thicker than this, it just basically, it almost turns into a dry brush, and it stops straight away. Whereas here, I've got it thick enough to keep that strong mark when I apply it, but I just have to keep kind of pushing the paint along, or dragging it along, sorry, not pushing it. If you push the paint, you get a completely different mark, and you don't really want to be using paint this thick for that kind of push effect. but you can see the you know, I keep going back over these lines and things and kind of dragging them out. If the paint was thinner, as you go over these lines, there's a good chance actually that you could be rubbing some of the paint off when you're going over it. Whereas in this case, the paint's because it's that bit thicker, it's sort of drying already as you're applying it. So you're just kind of carrying on the line. It takes a bit of practice, but it's just kind of feeling the paint as you apply it. It sounds dumb, but it's one of the most important things to learn when painting, because as painters we can give you all the information we can, but it still doesn't translate into you kind of feeling the paint, how it moves. You know, we can tell you all the consistencies, but you still have to understand why those consistencies work. And in this case, having the thinner consistency will just not make the marks that you want. So here you can see I'm using, well, you can't see because the wet palette's run out, but I'm using Kislev flesh to paint in these veins. And so this will then allow me to use the Ushabti bone to pick out the raised areas. So obviously this is, I'm painting this as a line, but I want it to look like it kind of goes over, so it's like a vein going over the line below it. So from the line underneath the eye to that second line, it looks like it's kind of curving over. So there is a slight curve in the line anyway, but if you look at the two finished wings, there is a highlight line, like a highlight mark on each of these little veins that you paint on. So just remember when you're painting the veins on, that they have to be highlighted. So if you do them too small, you're going to find it much harder to go back and then highlight the line, because the highlight position, it goes straight along the second line, so it looks like that line is raised, and it's just adding more depth to the detail. You can see here as well how I'm dragging some of these lines out and just kind of forcing them to flow into the previous shape. So I was talking about that before, the flow and the wave of the lines, and they all kind of sort of flow into each other. So the eyelash lines that you've been painting kind of curve around and then flow towards the butthole shape at the back of the wing. But then what you'll also find is that as these lines cross over other details, and some of those details are softer, you can then turn those shapes that you know, those crossover shapes into indentations on the wings already. So if you look on the top right hand wing where I've got the lines going over towards the butthole shape, there are certain kind of hole shapes that are kind of softer than they're not like the dark Rhinox hide dots around the edge of the wing. They're just that bit softer, and then you can just highlight them, and it gives it more depth to the piece. So that's the end of this video. There will be another video very soon where we'll finish off the wing and paint in the eyes. But that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.